that you're here, and I hope that you are too. And if you're just joining us, we began a new series this year on one of the most suspenseful and spellbinding books of the Old Testament, and that is the book of Daniel. Set during the Babylonian exile, the book of Daniel tells the story of four Hebrew youths, Daniel himself, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who've been seized and enslaved by King Nebuchadnezzar's unrivaled army. Daniel and his three companions were taken captive during the fall of Jerusalem and deported to Babylon, where they've been forced to serve in the royal palace. And despite experiencing terrible burdens, these young men remained brave, and God blessed them with tremendous success. He gave them an aptitude for learning Babylonian culture and language. They quickly impressed the king with their God-given wisdom and insight. In the second chapter of Daniel, which we studied last Sunday, Daniel and his friends found themselves in a dire situation when King Nebuchadnezzar made an impossible demand, insisting that his wise men and royal advisors literally read his mind and explain to him not only the meaning of a dream that he had the night before, but tell him what the dream was. He wouldn't even tell them what the dream was about. Thankfully, God intervened and delivered Daniel by revealing the secrets of the king's dream to him in a vision. And Daniel was able to explain to the king that God gave him a vision of the future. Specifically, Nebuchadnezzar foresaw the rise and fall of four successive kingdoms, including Babylon. And eventually, all four of those kingdoms would be supplanted by God's own kingdom, a kingdom without borders or boundaries that would encompass the globe and never be destroyed. And so after hearing this explanation from Daniel about the dream that he had, Nebuchadnezzar promotes Daniel to the highest position in the royal court and showered him with gifts and puts him in charge of all the other wise men and advisors. And thus these Hebrew exiles became some of the king's most trusted consultants. And when Daniel gives credit to God for both the dream and for its interpretation, King Nebuchadnezzar praises Daniel's God, calling him a God of gods and a king of kings. Unfortunately, Nebuchadnezzar's fascination with Daniel's God was short-lived. If you have a Bible or an app on your phone, go ahead and open it up to Daniel chapter 3, and you can follow along with us there. As this next chapter in the book of Daniel begins, we discover a story, an unforgettable story of vanity, valor, and victory. The story begins with the king's vanity. If you'll recall from chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In his dream, he saw this huge shining statue of a man. And the head was made out of gold, the chest and arms were made out of silver, belly and thighs were made of bronze, and the legs were made of iron. And of course, Daniel explains to him that the head of gold represented Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom Babylon. And then the other three metals represented other kingdoms that would rise to power successively after Babylon, and each one would supplant the previous one. Well, seemingly with that dream in mind, King Nebuchadnezzar, the Bible says in Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar has recreated the statue from his dream, but rather than incorporating the silver and the bronze and the iron, he makes the entire thing out of gold from head to toe, suggesting that he wanted his kingdom to last forever, to endure, rather than being replaced by these other kingdoms. And he then holds this massive unveiling ceremony and issues a summons all across his ever-growing empire to all the officials and governors and advisors and treasurers and judges and district rulers, etc., from all across the empire to come and witness this unveiling ceremony. And the enormous crowd gathered in the shadow of the statue. Here's a royal advisor, or a royal herald, that is, shouting in verse 4 through 6. He says, "People of all races and nations and language, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." And so as the orchestra starts playing, the entire assembly just falls to the ground and worships this golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, in addition to the kingdom of Judah, the Babylonians had conquered several other smaller nations as well. And of course, all of these different nations and tribes had their own gods, their own religious practices. And so part of the purpose of this seems to be to kind of unite all of the people that they have conquered and incorporated into Babylon. Worship was important. If he can get everybody in the entire kingdom to worship one idol, to worship the same God, then everybody would be united and he can consolidate his power. But what this statue really represented was King Nebuchadnezzar's unparalleled pride and vanity. He wanted to rule an empire that would bow down to his image, his own overinflated vision of himself. This 90-foot tall golden statue was an expression of Nebuchadnezzar's enormous ego. Of course, you don't have to be the supreme ruler of a mighty empire in order to fall victim to your own vanity. Anyone can be susceptible to an out-of-control ego. Many of us have a tendency to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. I'm reminded of this heavily booked commercial flight that out of Denver that had gotten canceled. And there's this one airline agent who's trying to rebook flights for an entire long line of grumpy, inconvenienced passengers, when suddenly a well-known celebrity passenger pushes his way to the front of the line. He slaps his ticket on the table and says, "I need to be on this flight, and it has to be first class, and it has to be now." And so the lady at the desk says, "I'm sorry, sir, I'd be happy to help you, but you have to wait until I'm done helping all these other people first." And he responds by saying, "Do you have any idea who I am?" And the young lady at the desk just quietly picks up her PA system microphone, and she says into it, "May I have your attention, please? We have a passenger here who does not know who he is. If anybody can identify him, please come to the gate." And as the man retreated to the back of the line, the entire crowd applauded for her. The Bible warns in Proverbs 16, verse 18, it says, "Pride goes before destruction, and haughtiness before a fall." Anytime that we think more highly of ourselves than we should, we're headed for trouble. Unfortunately, King Nebuchadnezzar's vanity threatened not only himself, but anyone who refused to follow his orders, including 3 young Hebrew men who refused to worship idols of any kind. So in addition to the king's vanity, this is also a story of valor. It's a story of valor. As after the ceremony, some of the king's astrologers approached him privately. These are the other wise men and enchanters, etc., that work for the king. And they tell King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue. But there are some Jews, Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also known, their Jewish names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were given these new names so that they would blend in Babylon. But these three guys refused to fall down and worship the statue. They worshiped the one true God. They loved the God of Israel, and they determined never to worship another God. So when everyone else fell to the ground, they valiantly stood tall. These Babylonian wise men that reported them were evidently jealous of their Jewish counterparts, and they were vying for royal positions, and so they blew the whistle on them. And you might notice they don't mention Daniel. I found that peculiar. I don't know if maybe Daniel was just, back at the palace taking care of royal business or something like that. But I tend to suspect that these guys left Daniel out because they were afraid of him. Remember, Daniel in the last chapter was promoted to the highest position in the court. They might not have been ready to tangle with Daniel, but they had no problem picking on his three friends who were not in such a high position. Of course, when King Nebuchadnezzar hears that these Jewish wise men refused to obey his orders, he flew into a rage, and he ordered that Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego be brought before him. And then he questions them, beginning in verse 14. He says, "Is it true, Shadrack, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue that I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Can you imagine just being in their shoes? I mean, what do? Do you stick to your guns and risk being literally burned alive in a blazing furnace? These three young men could have rationalized any number of reasons to compromise their convictions. I mean, we could just worship the statue one time and then ask God to forgive us afterward. He's a forgiving God after all. We could just bow down and pretend to worship the statue, but really, we could be in our own hearts and minds praising the one true God. Or, God does tell us to obey the governing authorities, and King Nebuchadnezzar told us to do this, so we got to do what he says. We're not hurting anybody. If we get ourselves killed, then we won't be able to help all of our brothers and sisters who are here in exile. All of these excuses sound sensible at first, but they're dangerous rationalizations that would destroy their testimony and their influence, and most importantly, it would destroy their relationship with God. It would be a sin against the God who loved them and brought them this far. The Lord commanded the Israelites in 2 Kings 17, verse 35, he said, "Do not worship any other gods or bow down to them." It was the breaking and ignoring of this command that led to Judah's destruction. Worshiping other gods, in other words, is how they got themselves in this mess. This is why they've been conquered and taken captive by Babylon. Thankfully, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't make any excuses. Instead, they valiantly stood their ground. I want you to listen to their response. This is what one of the three speaks up in verse 16, and he says, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." What bravery and valor. These young men valiantly stood their ground, speaking to an angry king who was threatening to kill them. They had complete faith that God would rescue them, but even if he didn't, they said, even if my assumption that God will save us from this is misplaced, it didn't matter. They still refused to compromise, knowing that an enraged king was about to throw them alive into a blazing furnace. They stood up for God. So what's our excuse? What's your excuse? Are you willing to stand up for God no matter the consequences? And when you do stand for God, you're going to stand out. I mean, can you imagine the scene at this giant golden statue when the music starts playing and the entire audience, everybody just falls to the ground and bows before this thing except these three young men? They would have stuck out like a sore thumb. Everybody's on their knees except for them. And the same happens when we stand up for God too. We're different. We stand out. People notice it. And a lot of people won't like it. It may be painful, and it won't always be a happy ending. But faith in God requires us to have courage, to stand up and say, if God rescues me, or even if He doesn't, I will not worship and bow down to any other God. And you know what? There's not a lot of people in our country or our culture who are trying to get us to worship any false idols or images. You know, we don't have giant statues that anybody wants us to bow down to or anything like that. But we face temptation every day to bow down before the gods of this world. Whether it's money or self or a political group or whatever it is, anytime we put something or someone above God, we're doing exactly what Nebuchadnezzar wanted. But next, we see that Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego's valor resulted in victory. This is a story of victory. And the Bible says that Nebuchadnezzar became so furious that his face became distorted. Have you ever seen like somebody gets so mad that their face just turns red and twisted and ugly? I see it all the time, especially in the mirror. But he commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than normal. And then he ordered some of the strongest men in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. The furnace, by the way, was not just like this small oven for cooking dinner or heating a house. This was like an industrial furnace that would have been used for baking bricks or smelting metals. The temperatures inside this furnace were hot enough to ensure that nobody could survive. In fact, the Bible says in verse 22 and following, because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. He got his own men killed because he was so angry at these young Jewish men. And so it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. And that's it, right? Story's over. The king wins. Everybody goes home. That's the last we hear of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But that's not the end of the story. Moments later, the king jumps up in amazement and he exclaims to his advisors in verse 24, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" And I can just imagine people saying like, yeah, I mean, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Yeah, it was just 3. But then the king says in the next verse, again shouting, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." King Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't know what else to do. He was just floored, looking inside this fire and seeing people moving around, not corpses withering up and burned, but walking and talking amongst themselves. And so he got as close to the fire as he could, and he calls out, he says, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come out of there." And the Bible says in verse 26 and following, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Can you imagine? That is just so mind-blowing. God miraculously protected Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the midst of a raging fire and gave them this amazing victory. And this 4th person that they saw in there who looked like the son of the gods just disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. I want you to notice something though. God didn't stop these three from being thrown into the fire. Instead, he joined them there. It was obvious to those watching that this fourth person was supernatural. Maybe it was an angel. I prefer to think that this was Christ himself. But in either case, the message is clear. In the midst of the fire, God was with them. And I doubt you or I will ever have our faith tested quite like this. We're not likely to be thrown into a blazing furnace. But life is full of fiery ordeals. When you have a heart attack, your mother or your wife or your child gets cancer, your marriage falls apart, your children rebel, you lose your job, sickness, mental illness, the list just goes on and on. Things might be heating up in your life. Maybe you took a stand for God, but things just got worse. And now you find yourself staring down a fire like you've never seen before. You thought that God would save you from the fire. You prayed that God would save you from the fire, but things just keep getting hotter. The reality is God doesn't promise to put out the fire, but he will bring you through it. He promised the people of Israel in Isaiah, this is right before the Babylonians came and conquered and captured them. He says in Isaiah, "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by my name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze." When Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah came out of the fire, they fulfilled this promise. And God's promise to Israel is his promise to you. Whatever troubles or trials you've been facing, Jesus will walk with you in the fire. And that's where the victory is. When they came out of the fire untouched and unharmed, everyone was just amazed and astounded. And King Nebuchadnezzar praised them and promoted them just as he had Daniel. He made a law that said no one could speak a negative word about the God of Israel because, as he says in verse 29, there is no other God who can rescue like this. Nebuchadnezzar's faith and fascination with Daniel's God continued to grow. And by the end of his reign, he declares in Daniel chapter 4, verse 37, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud." Nebuchadnezzar came full circle. And instead of expecting people to worship his image, he humbled himself before the one true God and learned to worship him. The faith of these four young men left an indelible mark on the king and kingdom of Babylon. The exciting story of Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, I think, yields many lessons for us today. The story reveals the foolishness of human vanity. As Nebuchadnezzar learned, God is able to humble the proud. The story also spotlights the valor of these young men, willing to stand up for the one true God, no matter what the consequences are. Their courage and conviction is an example for all of us. And finally, the story reminds us that victory is often found in the fire. While God doesn't promise to put out the fires that we face in life, he does promise to join us in them. Next week, we'll flash forward some 60 years to the fall of the mighty Babylonian Empire and the rise of Persia. In the meantime, maybe things are starting to heat up in your own life. Maybe you're wrestling with the sin of pride, or your loyalty to God is being tested, or maybe you're going through a fiery ordeal right now and you just feel like you're about to get burned. Whatever you're facing, I want to encourage you to trust God to see you through it. Know that he'll be with you no matter what's going on. And if I can help in any way, please come talk with me while we stand and sing. Let's sing together, church.